Now I'd like to go to the general economy. Igor Kouzmin's is the chief economist at RenCap for following Russia and the CIS. RenCap's been around for a long time. They have a history of surviving crises, and it's nice to see that they're surviving the one that started in 2008 and I'm not sure has been finished yet. Has the Russian economy finally got through the crisis, or are we doomed to another number of years of less than good economic weather? Igor, it's yours.
Good evening. Thank you very much. So please, first of all, let me kindly thank the organizers of the event for providing me with the opportunity to talk today. During my talk, I would present briefly our Russian macro outlook for the next few years. Obviously, this year, Russia is facing a very challenging environment, given a drop in oil prices and Western sanctions. Oil prices dropped nearly by 40% year-on-year, while oil and refined accounted for more than a half of Russian exports and were responsible for around a half of Russian federal budget revenues. Western sanctions force Russia to pay off around $70 billion of external debt a year. Both things are quite painful for Russian economy. But such volatile situation is also quite painful for us, for economists, as this is very difficult to make any concrete forecasts in such volatile environment. And ultimately, we're not trying to do that. Instead, we consider various scenarios. The table on this chart, on our view, summarizes nearly everything that we need to know about Russian macro in 2015. It has such indicators as GDP growth, ruble inflation, reserves, debt, and current account. And it shows our base case of $60 oil for all these indicators, and it shows how the picture could be changed if oil price would be stronger or weaker. We are including oil prices between 100 and 30. Of course, we do not think that these extremes could be achievable, but still we try to put them here to assess the potential bottom for the market. The table has a lot of numbers, but the broad conclusion is the following. The fall in GDP growth is huge. Ruble is much weaker than it was previously. Inflation is very high. So general macro outlook looks quite bleak. But budget deficit is fairly moderate. Russian current account surplus stays positive at any oil prices, providing currency to pay off external debt. And Russian reserves are not declining so fast. So despite bleak outlook this year, general sustainability of economy, it stays in place. So let's go briefly through main indicators. For GDP growth, we forecast that it could fall by 4.3% this year at $60 oil. However, we do see upside risks to our forecast, and today I could tell that we estimate that GDP growth this year should be slightly less than 4%. So it's still a huge contraction of growth, but it's still less than 4%. And the main sources of fall in GDP growth, it's a fall in domestic demand. First, we are mostly concerned about domestic investment demand, capital expenditure this year. With low oil revenues, external deleveraging, very tight domestic credit conditions, and elevated business uncertainty, investments could fall by 12% this year. This compares with a 15% fall in the year of 2009. In addition, with negative real wages growth of -9%, domestic consumer demand might fall by 5%, which is the print that we witnessed in the previous crisis. However, we point out three factors that could limit the potential downside for the Russian economy. The first one is low unemployment. I could give you some anecdotal example. At the end of the previous year, we had a client trip, and we had an excellent taxi driver. He was very polite. He was very quiet. He had perfect fluent English. So at the end of the trip, our client was impressed by the quality of services, and he asked him whether Russia has the best taxi drivers in the whole world. But the answer was that obviously that guy, he was not a taxi driver, and he worked previously in a chain of Russian luxury food stores, and he was responsible for managing contacts with their Western vendors. But as soon as Russia introduced food embargo on imports from European Union countries, that guy has lost his job, and he couldn't find another job in this field because no one needed his skills at this stage. So he became a taxi driver. This means that, of course, it's a huge downshifting, but still, this man, he stays employed. So he keeps some basic level of consumption working in a good taxi company. So it shows the Russian problem. It shows our problem that Russia faces a shortage of labor domestically, as Russian demographic situation is bad. Russian working age population is falling by 1 million people a year, and it's a big headwind for the long-term growth. But in crisis times, it serves like a good hedge from such situations that we see in Greece when unemployment was rising to 25%, for example. So we think that there would be only a moderate increase in unemployment to 6.5% this year. This could limit the potential downside risks for consumer demand. Another two things are much weaker currency and import substitution that my colleague, our previous speaker, discussed previously. And the final thing is that Russian economy is not overheated. In the previous crisis, before the previous crisis, economy was overheated, and we had huge destocking in the year of 2009, with cuts in stocks shaving off 7% from the headline GDP growth figure. This time, Russia has already suffered from destocking during the previous few years, so we think that the level of stocks are still quite low, and we estimate that further destocking should not shave more than 2% from Russian GDP growth. So with all of that, we think that fall in GDP growth could be slightly less than 4% this year. This compares with 7.8% fall in the year of 2009. However, the problem is that the GDP growth perspective for this year, it becomes yesterday's news. And ultimately, I think in a few months ahead, no one would care whether Russian GDP growth would fall by 2.5% or by 5.2% this year. The main issue is what happens with Russia in the long run, and what could be the growth trajectory in the next few years. Again, we can't provide here any concrete forecast. We have scenarios. Talking about next year, we do not see that the recession would be prolonged, and we do not see negative GDP growth next year. This is a good thing because some market economists and some institutions like IMF at the start of the year, they were promising 2 years of negative GDP growth in Russia. Today they are upgrading their forecasts and telling that negative GDP growth next year is unlikely. So we estimate that Russian GDP growth to accelerate to 1.8% next year if oil price recovers to $75 or $80 a barrel. If oil price stays flat, then we see Russian growth around 0. Again, it could be slightly positive, slightly negative, but we do not see big negative reading next year. It's more difficult to talk about longer-term growth perspective, but we assume that if oil prices recover to $80 a barrel and Western sanctions would be lifted, then Russia has potential to grow by 2.5% each year. If Western sanctions remain in place, then potential growth would be capped by 1.5%. It is quite low figure, so both figures are much lower than we had at the start of 2000s. They are lower than 4% growth in 2010, 2012. Still, they are higher than 1.3 and 0.6% growth that we've seen in the previous 2 years. But still, we have hopes that at least European Union sanctions could be lifted in the year of 2016 or the year of 2017. Now I'd like to tell a few words about currency. So again, we have scenarios, and we estimate for our base case of $60 oil that ruble could average around 57 rubles per dollar this year. The estimates could be different for different oil prices. But if we discuss the base case, then ruble averaged 59 in January-May of this year. This means that it could average at 55, 56 in the remainder of the year to hit our full year forecast. So 55, 56 rubles per dollar, it's our middle-term call for the currency. So we think that current ruble appreciation comes to an end. Ruble is overvalued a little bit now in our view. So it was driven by stronger current account, by big amount of liquidity provided by the central bank. Finally, by low debt redemptions that we've seen in the last few months. We think that both these factors are coming to an end, and current account would be lower in the remainder of the year, while debt redemptions increase in autumn and at the end of the year, which should take the currency lower. Again, central bank even started to purchase currency a little bit to tame ruble appreciations. So not much factors for continued ruble appreciation. Our forecast telling that it should be 55, 56 in the remainder of the year. But the last thing on ruble is that the main problem behind currency dynamics is that ruble is still trying to find a new equilibrium level, and ultimately I think that no one, including us, knows where the currency should be and what is the fair value of the currency today. And one of the main reasons here, apart from oil or sanctions, is that the level of dollarization of Russian economy is changing now. We think that we could see this year the same thing we've seen in 2009, when the level of dollarization spiked from 15% to 20%. So we think it should spike from 20% to 25 or 30% this year. But no one knows how domestic economic agents would behave themselves. What is the confidence in ruble now? And the lower level of dollarization is, the lower is the fair value of the currency, because there's a lower permanent demand for rubles and high demand for dollars. But the last month gives us some confidence that ruble could be close to our fair value, so it gives us more confidence in our ruble forecast that we discussed. The last big component is inflation. Inflation spiked to nearly 17% in March, but I would not call it inflation, as ultimately it looked like the prices were simply shifting to the new level that would be in line with the new quality level of the exchange rate. But this process came to an end, and we see that inflation is now declining. So high inflation this year, it's mainly a problem of a weaker exchange rate and of falling confidence in currency. And the day of 16 December 2014, when ruble lost 25% of its value nearly in 2 hours and reached 80, we think that those 2 hours, they lifted Russian inflation for the few percentage points during the next few years. But anyway, it looks like the situation is normalizing now. So the shift of prices to the new level happened. Ruble performs quite well, and we see a fall in consumer demand, a fall in GDP growth, which should tame further increases in prices. In the base case, we forecast that inflation could fall to 11.5% at the end of this year and decline further to 7% at the end of next year. The last two big topics that I would like to discuss today is the central bank and government policy. It's crucial for our institutions to provide savvy and confident policies now, during the crisis times, and generally, as far as we see it, from the central bank and the government, we see some efforts to try to combine the best practices that were carried out in the previous crises of 1999 and 2009. So from the crisis of 2009, Russian authorities want to ensure the sustainability of the Russian financial markets and of the Russian banking sector. And it looks like they're hitting this target quite well. From the crisis of 1999, authorities want to see much weaker exchange rate to encourage import substitution. And this is the main story here. So this goal is also within reach. So talking about central bank policy, central banks started to ease rates from 17% at the start of the year to 12.5% now. Considering quite good inflation forecasts, we think that the key rate could be lowered further to 10% by the end of this year and to 6.5% by the end of 2016. Central bank policy easing should provide quite good grounds for investment recovery in the middle term and also for the prices of Russian fixed income assets denominated in rubles. Talking about exchange rate policy, Russian Central Bank officially moved to floating exchange rate regime from the start of this year, but floating becomes very complicated. With the purely floating exchange rate regime, we have FX refinancing operations, and the amount now stands around at $35 billion. We have some unpredictable interventions to tame excessive volatility. Now we have planned purchases of currency. So the question is it still free-floating? Our answer is that yes, it's still free-floating, because generally free-floating, it's something that we never see in across all the emerging and developed market economies, and all the central bank, even under free-floating regime, intervene from time to time on the market. So ultimately free-floating, it only means that the central bank is not targeting some particular level of the exchange rate. So we think that it's still here. How the central bank could react to different exchange rate behavior in this new exchange rate regime? So we think that if ruble would be falling again, we would see very limited support for the currency. So in case something bad happens, the downside for the ruble, they could be unlimited. However, despite some calls that we see in press today, we do not think that central bank could take any particular steps to weaken exchange rate specifically. We do not expect this. On another side, if ruble would be appreciating, we think that central bank could take some soft steps to tame ruble appreciation, to be in line with this target of our authorities to encourage import substitution in the country. However, we do not think that the central bank could tame ruble appreciation very aggressively unless we see some heavy capital inflows to the country and ruble appreciation like it was doing at the start of 2000, which looks unlikely for us at this stage. Talking about the government, we obviously hear a lot of calls for such things as structural reforms going forward and improving Russian investment climate and all these things. We think that some big breakthrough in structural reforms is possible only if oil prices would stay low for the next 5 years, somewhere at $60 or around that level. So this is not our base case. We think that oil prices could recover at least to $80 per barrel. So we do not have heavy hopes for structural reforms, but this is a very usual story that we've seen in the past 20 years. What is important is that in current crisis, there is a perception that crisis, it's time for us and Russia to do something that we haven't done previously. Because when everything goes very well, there is no need to change something because people are enjoying that the situation looks quite well. So we expect to see some, not breakthrough, but some crucially important steps for authorities that indeed could improve Russian picture. The first one, it is the increase in the retirement age, increase in the pension age of the population. So ultimately, this is the most important chart about Russia, and this is the worst chart about Russia that I could show to you from the macro side. It shows that Russian working age population is declining during the next nearly 10 years, and that it is falling nearly by 1 million people a year in the base case. I should say that it also includes the migrant inflows to the country that are forecasted at quite optimistic level. So when Russia is losing from 1.3, around 1% of working age population a year, it is crucial for a country to start increasing the retirement age. We see very big chances that in the next few years, this decision would be finally taken, and that working age population, that the retirement age of the population would be increased from 55, 60 for women and men to 63 for both categories, and it would be a gradual increase by 6 months each year. So it would be discussed, but this could be a very important point. And the second thing is that the government now plans to freeze wages in the state sector. It is not a very friendly solution for the general public, and ultimately this is a stage when economy and economists becomes cruel, and they are talking about quite unpleasant decision for people. But what we've seen in the last years is that this shortage of labor on domestic market, coupled with very aggressive hikes in state wages, it kept wages in the private sector of the economy under pressure, and nominal wages in Russia were constantly increasing. As a result, companies' costs on personnel, they were always climbing higher and higher, and this is the red line on my chart. On the opposite side, corporate profits or gross profits of the economy, they were falling during the last years, and they are now staying below 35%. So it is quite low. It means that only a third of the whole income that is generated by the economy, it goes to companies. And it undermines investments in Russia, because companies do not have enough sources to build up further investment projects. So we think that this theme in public wages in this year and next year, so public wages are planned to be increased only by 5% this year. They should be kept flat in the year of 2016. Even in the year of 2017, we see only a 7% increase in state wages, which is quite low from historical perspective. This very low increase in state wages, it should also tame the increase in private sector wages. And all of that could reduce the share of profits of the economy that go to workers and increase the share of profits that go to companies. As a result, we hope that companies would have more grounds for investments. This could be very important to rebuild something, to make very important opportunities, and to take some opportunities that current crisis provides us, such opportunities as import substitutions, to make a fresh start and ultimately to make Russian perspectives slightly brighter than we think they are today. So thank you very much for your attention. I would be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Oleg. Do we have a second microphone? There we go. Question.
Thank you very much for the speech. I have a question about government balance and the government budget, actually. You probably know that Russia spent almost half of its defense budget in the first quarter. What do you think would be the effect of defense spending on GDP and the economy as a whole?
Yes, thanks for your question. It's a very good point, because indeed Russia did very big military spending at the start of the year. As a result, the deficit of Russian budget increased to 4.5% of GDP in the first quarter. So people are starting to frighten about sustainability of Russian budget. What we want to say is that it was the accelerated military spending, and it means that they spend more on military in the first quarter. It should be less in the remainder of the year, so budget deficit would be lower. Officially, they have minus 3.7% of GDP budget deficit. Due to slightly better oil forecast and weaker exchange rate, we think that budget deficit would be kept by 2.3% of GDP. But the fact that they did heavy military spending in the first quarter, we think it could influence to some extent GDP growth reading, and it could be one of the reasons why GDP growth contracted only by 1.9% year-on-year in the first quarter. So military spending supported to some extent growth in the first quarter. But generally, our view is that military spending, it's a kind of less efficient government spending, because even if we omit some corruption stuff and all this stuff, it is not something that it creates one product and this product then stays in place. So it's not creating a product then creates an additional product. So it's simply you made a tank and your tank is standing. Hopefully it's not fighting and producing or decreasing some GDP. But these military products are not products that could produce further growth. So this is why this is, purely from economic side, this is less efficient spending of the government.
Thanks for the speech. What's your view of increase of labor productivity and aging structure from mid to long term?
So labor productivity was increasing in Russia, but it was well, increasing quite low in the recent years. It was moving generally more or less in line with general real GDP growth. So it was around 2-3% after the crisis, and the increase in productivity declined to below 2% in the last 2 years. So this is an issue. The increase in the working age population, on one hand, we could think that it could reduce labor productivity because we have just more workers on the market that would be producing more or less the same GDP growth. But still, we see more positives from this side, because one of the Russian problems is that this is the low competition on the labor market sometimes, when some workers could be quite comfortable with not working properly because they know that there would not be a replacement for them. So from this perspective, the increase in working age population could help to increase the competition on the Russian labor market, and it should be positive for labor productivity. In addition, if it helps to keep some workers in the sectors where we didn't have a lot of inflows from a younger generation at the start of 1990s, these workers could be more productive than the migrants that could replace them. So ultimately, it would help us to go through this tough time when we see some fall in specialists in particular areas, because there are only older people that are working there before and only very young specialists that are starting to enter this market now, but no, middle-aged specialists. So we think that it would help to keep the older specialists at work, while younger specialists would still be entering this market, especially if we are talking about such things as import substitution, because if some sectors in the Russian economy become more competitive and would be able to produce competitive salaries, then I think that the people who are, for example, selling mobile phones now, they could go and work in some other sphere. I think this is quite possible if these sectors provide more or less good corporate culture and more or less good salaries. So generally, I think that the increase in labor age, in retirement age, should be positive for labor productivity.
We have one more question on the economics, and then we'll go and find out if $60 is the right answer.
Thanks for your speech. My question: can you share your view about long-term forecast of GDP till 2020? Will it have like a modest growth, like 1 or 2% per year, or it will have like high restoration in 2017 and like slow down till 2020? Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for question. So we have -4 this year, or slightly lower. We have 1.8 in 2016. Looking forward, what we talk is that it could be 2, 2.5 if sanctions are lifted, or 1, 1.5 if sanctions remain in place. Our base case is that sanctions are lifted, so we hope for 2, 2.5% growth. The question is growth trajectory. The year of 2017 is a pre-election growth in Russia, so obviously we expect some government stimulus to keep higher popularity of the president. So we expect additional government spending in the year of 2017, and considering good base effects, that it means that GDP growth in 2017 could accelerate more, probably from 1.8 to somewhere above 2.5 if sanctions are lifted. After that, we could see growth slightly below 2% in 2018, and next it's 2, 2.5 depending on other factors. If sanctions remain in place, then we are talking about the same story, but this would be the numbers of some low level. So 1.8 2016, sanctions remain in place, it could be slightly above 2% in pre-election year of 2017. Then the same trajectory. So that's our views.
After the last question, one question. Go ahead.
Цене на нефть. Что касается ближайших недель, у нас был тренд на укрепление рубля. С 18 мая мы видим, что рубль слабеет, и уже больше недели Центробанк покупает валюту. Сегодняшнее ослабление рубля – это результат того, что накопилась какая-то критическая масса, или все-таки какие-то другие факторы? Что будет в ближайшие недели?
Да, спасибо за вопрос. Рубль стал еще сложнее прогнозировать даже на несколько дней вперед, потому что, как мы видели, стоимость может меняться очень резко даже в течение одного дня. Но тем не менее, да, в последние дни рубль ослаб. Мы думаем, что это, в первую очередь, связано, опять же, с снижением цен на нефть в последние дни. От этого очень сложно абстрагироваться. Потом прошел налоговый период. И в конце концов власти очень ясно показали, что рубль сильно крепче 50 их не очень устраивает, в связи с чем рынок стал ожидать каких-то агрессивных действий при дальнейшем укреплении курса. И, соответственно, те, кто надеялись на продолжение такого устойчивого тренда, уже, я думаю, что эти надежды ушли. Но в целом, то, что мы видим сейчас, мы думаем, что рубль действительно начал возвращаться ближе к какой-то фундаментальной стоимости. Наверное, в ближайшие недели, скажем так, да, мы бы ждали, что рубль может еще потерять несколько процентов. Скажем, например, если рубль достигнет, примерно, опять же, наших оценок 55-56, скажем, как такая среднесрочная цена, мы полагаем, что на этом уровне уже Центральный банк может и прекратить покупки валюты. Спасибо.